In today's climate of racial injustice, so many emotions are being felt across the world, from anger to sadness to confusion. Come find out more today from the perspective of our guest, an experienced civil rights attorney, what the situation is, where our rights and responsibilities lie, and what's around the corner on Asked and Answered. Hi everybody, this is Richard Wong. Welcome to Asked and Answered. We're lucky to have David Helbraun here with us today, who obtained his bachelor's degree from Yale University and then his JD from Hastings College of Law in San Francisco, where he also eventually founded Helbraun Law Firm, where he has been practicing as a litigation and trial attorney for the past 20 years and past 30 years overall. David has a special emphasis on civil rights and police brutality. So I'm so grateful, David, that you're joining us here today in light of the recent events and national uprising stemming from the George Floyd incident in Minnesota. It's been quite a year, starting with COVID and now what's going on in the front of racial injustice. How are you doing?
Oh, well, I'm doing okay, considering it's been a rough week in so many ways around the country and in the Bay Area. It's very emotionally disturbing, and it's important to see these episodes happening.
Right, and so your specialty being so relevant to what we're seeing on the news every day on a daily basis, what can you tell the listeners about what the status quo is and how much of what people are seeing in the news now is what you would consider normal in your day-to-day business operations?
Well, I find it extremely heartening to see the level of interest, the level of protests happening around the country around the issue of policing and police brutality. This is something I've been working on for many years now, as well as my colleagues, and it's been very hard in general to convince the community, and in particular juries, that this is a genuine problem. And usually when I present these cases, I need to do it in the sense that these are one-off cases with a particular bad apple. And while I don't mean to tar all police officers with that brush, because there are many, many good police officers who do a good job, nevertheless, police misconduct, uses of excessive force, and tragically deaths because of unreasonable excessive force is a lot more common than people generally think, in my view, and given my experience. So I'm pleased to see the level of understanding rising now in the community like this.
Right, and obviously attention given to it. Speaking to that problem, where is the disproportionate use of law enforcement? What statistics are there to kind of shed more light on that to our listeners?
Well, there have been a lot of studies over the years, in particular with regard to racial disparities in policing. In general, some of the studies I've seen say, for instance, that African American people are twice as likely to get stopped either on the street or in traffic stops than white people. African American men are 3 times as likely, roughly, to experience some use of force against them as a result of some traffic stop or contact on the street than white people. And that's significant, and it's indicative of some systemic racial bias in our system of justice, which we need to address.
Right.
So things like people's appearances or the area in which they happen to be when that police contact occurs, all of that really should be irrelevant, except for whether there's any reason to believe that a crime has occurred and that a particular person is involved. And that certainly doesn't mean that they need to have enough evidence to prove a crime. That's not the kind of high standard we expect from police.
But at least probable cause.
Simply, even less for an investigation. And that is just a reasonable suspicion, which means just some kind of articulable fact, more than just a hunch, and more than just that you're black or in a poor neighborhood, some sort of factual information to say that some crime has been committed and that you may have some connection to it, or that they have a belief that you do have a connection to it.
David, by now everybody has seen the video footage that the young lady took of the George Floyd incident and distributed it to the entire world. But for the benefit of our listeners, how common is action like that by law enforcement? Is what we saw an anomaly, or is it more normal than people think?
Well, what we saw in that video, of course, was so extreme and horrifying. The kneeling on someone's neck for longer than 8 minutes, and with the hand in the pocket so casually. I mean, what that video captures about that particular police officer's approach, perspective, belief, entitlement, just speaks volumes. And it's one reason it's just so horrifying and has galvanized not just the country, but the world. Do police use force unreasonably and excessively? Yes. Do they do it a lot more than people think? Yes. It's with the advent of body cams and smartphones with cameras that we've seen much more of this on YouTube, on social media. And so people are able to actually comprehend what is going on when police officers use force unreasonably. Oftentimes, in my experience, when force is used unreasonably, police officers will create their own narrative to justify it. And it becomes their word against the word of their victim. And that's always a difficult position to be in if you're not the police, because in my experience, people, the community, jurors want to believe the police. They want to believe that they're doing their job properly and that they're not abusing their special rights. And unfortunately, I think the use of excessive force, hurting people without justification, occurs a lot more in our society than we think. And it occurs a lot more, and disproportionately so, against people of color, and in particular, African Americans.
In a lot of the cases, the video clip that people see, it doesn't capture the entire interaction, of course. And so there's an element of, how fair and how truthful video clips can be. It doesn't always tell the complete story, I guess.
Well, that's true, of course. And police officers have a certain mentality and are trained to have a certain mentality of asserting authority. And there are times when police officers, depending on their particular personal psychological makeup, may feel disrespected, feel that their quote unquote authority has been disrespected, and feel that they need to take action, very dominating authoritarian action, to basically tell somebody who the boss is. And that's where they get into trouble. And that's where I believe training of police officers is lacking. De-escalation is almost always a better policy, especially when you're policing the community, than escalation.
Yeah, it's such a tough issue because these people are hired and trained to serve and protect us. But it's a very, very thin line, as we sometimes see, of the bystanders who have been charged in that particular unit, with accessory to murder for what they will undoubtedly argue for just doing their jobs. It's definitely not an easy issue, right?
Well, all police officers, all law enforcement have a duty to intervene if they see something wrong going on, if they see unreasonable, unjustified force happening. And I would argue they have a heightened duty to do that. A citizen who witnesses this, like the woman who filmed what happened, is going to be reluctant to put their bodies on the line and to get in the way of someone being choked to death.
Right.
Other officers who are there, who are part of that team, have a special obligation to step in and put a stop to it. And that's where this sense of tribalism, this sense of us versus them, this blue wall of silence comes into play with a lot of officers who are reluctant to do that. And they need to be held accountable just as the other one does, because otherwise you will not incentivize those other officers to actually intervene the way they are supposed to.
Irrespective of what ranks they have, even if you have to intervene to your superior, it's the same standard.
That is correct.
Okay. Right. And if you are watching these videos from the safety of your home and considering going out to exercise your right to protest, or even thinking about bringing your children, what are some recommendations or advice you have for these people?
Well, first of all, the Constitution protects our right to free speech, and that includes protest. Protest is a terrific way to join with the community and to demonstrate how important an issue is, and to hopefully propel action by individuals in the community and by the legislature. So protests are a great thing to do, so long as they're peaceful.
And so some would argue, you know, you need to kind of take it to another level in order to get the attention that this issue deserves. And so conflicts with law enforcement are inevitable to the people with that kind of mindset. What if you are there participating peacefully and you come into potential conflict with law enforcement? What should you do as a citizen who's trying to do it peacefully?
Well, let's unpack that just a bit. If for some reason there is some sort of violence taking place by people other than the police, or some sort of provocation being made of the police in a physical sense. I don't include chants or talking to the police as provocations. But if there is some sort of provocation or violence taking place against the police, I would remove myself from that area. The police are entitled to protect themselves if some sort of violence is initiated to them, and if there's violence happening nearby the police, they are supposed to take some sort of action. Now that begs the question whether there's actually some sort of violence they should be addressing taking place, or whether the protest is peaceful. But if you're there, and if you're there with your kids, certainly try to remove yourself from the area where there's some conflict happening with the police. If you do find yourself coming into conflict with the police, do not resist, do not fight them, do not argue with them. Try to obey a lawful command. If it's to leave or move away, do that.
On a grander scale, where do you think we're headed, and what needs to be done to help solve some of these issues as an initial step? I know a lot has to be done, but where do we start? Where can we start?
Some fairly simple things that can be done, such as basically outlawing certain types of use of force, like the chokehold, like the kinds of chokeholds, putting knees on people's throats, things like that are just proven to be just excessive uses of force that are likely to result in someone's death, and they should just be outright prohibited. Officers have many tools available to them, and that's just one example of something that could be outlawed either on a state-by-state basis or in a federal overriding standards basis.
Are you saying that moves like that can be potentially lethal are, when, even if they're just excluded from, let's say, a basic training manual, they're still not specifically prohibited because it's not written anywhere?
Those holds are not specifically prohibited in a lot of jurisdictions. There are extensive policies written in every police department about when to use them, and that's not enough. They should just be prohibited. In my experience, again and again, police officers will offer post facto justifications, rationales, their version of events to justify uses of force that they've used. And chokeholds, I think, are just um, too open to abuse. So they should be outlawed. That's a simple one.
Okay.
On the greater scale of things, what can be done? Um, for one thing, there needs to be more accountability. There's the question of criminal convictions for when police kill people without justification. And those are always difficult cases. And I'm not a criminal lawyer. I don't get involved in those. I'm a civil lawyer. I get involved in trying to hold the police accountable civilly, which simply means for money damages in a court of law and a judgment, a verdict by the jury that what they did was unreasonable and wrong. And even in that arena, it's difficult for various procedural reasons. For instance, there is a judicially created concept called qualified immunity that succeeds in throwing out many of these cases for reasons that have nothing to do with the law and the way the law has been written, but because judicially created exceptions have been made that give the police the benefit of the doubt as to whether what they were doing they should have known was unreasonable or excessive. That's a huge exception to accountability that really needs to be readdressed. There are other things. For instance, unions are there to protect their members, employees, and police departments, police officers have very, very strong unions that have a lot of strength and have achieved a lot of protections in terms of when an officer can be fired or reprimanded and what sort of procedures have to be observed to document and to establish a violation by them. And there need to be some different procedures involved for oversight of police and the avenues available to departments to reprimand or discipline police. Civilian oversight boards are a good way because they take the potential oversight and discipline out of the department, where you could argue there's a conflict of interest about the department policing itself and its own. Civilian oversight needs to have some teeth, and most of them don't.
Right.
Those are just a couple of examples.
Right. My next question is just like for the average citizen like myself, what is it that we can do to help support our local police enforcement agencies or to at least find a measure of accountability that you were talking about within our own individual communities?
Well, I think these protests are huge for that. Getting out in the street safely. We're in a COVID time. Please wear masks, try to distance yourself. But protests and mass protests are a huge way to communicate that people want to see something done. And that sort of physical presence, I think, helps motivate the legislature, the community councils, superintendents in your local counties and cities to take some sort of action, be it stricter rules for oversight for their police, be it reviewing the civil service and union rules that might offer perhaps too much protection to police compared to other employees and unions. Being active, certainly if you see something, videotaping it if you can, and reporting it if you can. And anything to support accountability of the police, both in your city administratively and also through lawsuits. Civil accountability in the law, I think, is something that ultimately police departments and cities pay attention to when juries hold police accountable for excessive uses of force.
And what about the victims from the incidents that we've seen, the Black Lives Matter movement? What are some of the things that, whether you're a person of color or not, what are some of the things that you recommend we can do to help out the victims?
Well, you can join Black Lives Matter online and you can contribute. And there are many organizations that exist to support trying to hold police accountable and trying to review the kinds of rules that currently apply to them. There is the National Police Accountability Project, which is a project of the National Lawyers Guild, which you can donate to. And attorney members of that group, like myself, work together to try to hold police accountable, either through lawsuits and also through policy changes, through changes in the law. There are many organizations. The organization of the Cato Institute, CATO, is in the vanguard right now in trying to address this issue of what's called qualified immunity, which again is a judicially created immunity for officers under situations that the particular judge will decide should apply or not, basically, again, based on whether an officer should have known that what they were doing was unreasonable or excessive under the circumstances.
Constructive knowledge, right, right. David, I know you're a really busy person. Last question, when should somebody call you? When do you think, what signals or red flags should come up when somebody feels like their civil rights have been violated? When should they call you?
Well, obviously, call me if you've had some interaction with police or other law enforcement, sheriffs, where you feel that you've been mistreated, but in particular, if you've been arrested for no reason, if you've been detained for no reason, if you've been physically injured by the police and you were not resisting or doing anything that would cause a use of force on you. Generally, I tell people to cooperate with the police when you're interacting with them. Do not try to explain yourself. If you are arrested, assert your Fifth Amendment rights. Say that you're going to invoke your rights and you don't want to speak without a lawyer. You have to be pretty specific about that. You have to say something more than just, I want a lawyer. You have to say you're invoking your rights and you don't want to talk without a lawyer. Now, I'm not a criminal defense lawyer, and that's for a criminal charge. But if in the course of an interaction with the police, you find that you have been in some way treated unfairly, and in particular, if you've been physically injured as a result of that contact, or you've had to spend time overnight or longer in jail because of an arrest that was not justified, that's what lawyers like me and others are here to help you with.
Awesome, great advice. Thank you so much for the information, David, and for taking time out of your busy day to join me and to answer these really relevant and important questions for our listeners.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Please stay safe, and I'll see you soon.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Wong of Viridian Mortgage, and welcome to Ask and Answered. In this day and age of constantly streaming information at our fingertips, it's sometimes easy to fall prey to sensory overload. And so the goal of this program is to hear firsthand from those professionals who are the experts dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis and providing us with the clarity and direction we need during these challenging times. Thank you for watching. Be smart, stay safe, and take care.